podcast is part of the Sports Social Podcast Network.
This episode is brought to you by Underdog Fantasy, the easiest way to play season-long fantasy football. Underdog Fantasy sets your perfect lineup at the end of each week, so no management and no Tuesday nights on the waiver wire. All you do is the most fun part. Draft the best team and win cold, hard cash. Play now at UnderdogFantasy.com, and they'll match your first deposit up to $100 if you use code SPOTIFY.
Welcome back to the Love Tennis Podcast, an extended edition. This is no podlet, this is a full podcast. I'm James Gray of inews.co.uk and the I newspaper. I've got George Bellshaw with me, and our respected and well-known, renowned, some say notorious tennis coach, Calvin Betton, will be with us very shortly indeed. We're going to be looking at the semi-finals of the US Open. We'll look ahead to the final. I appreciate this might not land in your feed until after you've seen the women's final, but we'll talk about it anyway, and you can see just how wrong we got it. We'll start with the women's final, so that if you are listening hurriedly before Jabeur versus Swiatek, you can at least get that out of the way. Just quickly, I want to give you an update on fantasy tennis, which is obviously pretty much the main concern when it comes to George's fortnight during Grand Slams. It's pretty interesting. Well, it's been interesting for me because I've actually done quite well, which is a rarity. As
you've raced past me and Calvin.
Yeah, well, I wasn't going so well, and then Frances Tiafoe did me a few massive favours. So I'm now actually up to 14th with I think. Well, go on, George.
I was going to say the pendulum really swung for me in terms of our kind of three-way race when Tiafoe beat Nadal, because I've been like 3 points behind Calvin with the same players, and if Nadal had just won that and gone to the final as I was expecting, I would have won out of the three of us. But that result really swung it in your favour, and now you're going to win out of the three of us. So that was the key match of the tournament between.
I think I am clear. I'm 2 points clear of Calvin. I think we've both got Iga Swiatek. I think I'm right in saying as of last night, it is wrapped up at the top. Casper is 3.5 points clear. I think if Frances Tiafoe had won last night, that would have made things quite interesting. Diego Punta de Break might have overhauled Casper at the top, but not to be. Just run you through Casper's team: Carlos Alcaraz, Cam Norrie, Nick Kyrgios. Now I'm going to say this guy's name. Well, Wu Yibing is how it's written. I spoke to an expert on Chinese tennis the other day. It's not how it's pronounced, but unfortunately, I'm not even going to get close to how it's actually pronounced. She also had Andy Murray, Iga Swiatek, Coco Gauff, Caroline Garcia, Ayla Tomljanovic, and Linda Noskova, who laid an egg. So congrats, Casper. Tennis and Bones is in second, but I think can be overhauled if Ons Jabeur wins the final. So a few nervy moments perhaps for Tennis and Bones. Congrats also to Diego Punta Break, Susie Powell, Team Ross, Hannah, in the dirt like a dog, hoping I can stay awake to watch. Probably the most sleep deprived person, apart from maybe me. Well done to everyone who's played this year. It's been a busy one.
While I lost our three-way battle, James, I would like to say I did beat the people I actually bet bottles of wine with. So I've won 2 bottles of wine from my friends Motoko and Michelle. So it's not been all bad, despite losing our contest for pride.
Listeners can sleep easy knowing that you are 2 bottles of wine to the good. But they won't sleep easy if they don't hear about the women's final that is coming up. It's Ons Jabeur against Iga Swiatek, the number 5 seed against the number 1 seed. two previous Grand Slam finalists this year, of course. Jabeur reached the final of Wimbledon, Swiatek winning the French Open at Roland Garros. So there's some kind of consistency there, which is what we're always asking for in the WTA. Just to look back at the semi-finals briefly, they were on Thursday night here in New York, so overnight on Thursday. I actually was thinking that some people may not even have seen them, so I thought I'd quickly fill you in on them because I was there, which is sort of the point. The pick I thought would be Garcia-Jabeur, and it was a complete non-starter. Caroline Garcia played really poorly. It was really disappointing. Ons Jabeur played well. She served extremely well. You know, Garcia standing inside the baseline is all well and good, but when Jabeur, Garcia mentioned after she's got quite a low ball toss and quite a hard to read serve, and she was hitting her spots, in fairness. And when you're stood a foot inside the baseline and someone starts hitting their spots, well, it ends one way. Amazingly, her box were sat there telling her to come further forward, and they were like, no, get closer to the service box. That'll help, which I'm not convinced it would have done. But yeah, Jabeur won 6-1, 6-3. Swiatek beat Sabalenka 3-6, 6-1, 6-4. Iga Swiatek really was very poor in the first set. She wasn't really striking the ball. It was all over the place. And then, in her own words, she went off to the toilet and sorted herself out. She had a sort of accidental overshare in her post-match interview and then apologised and said, sorry, that's disgusting. But then she also said she gave herself a bit of a pep talk and did some problem solving. And she was brilliant in that second set and, to be quite frank, the third. But Aryna Sabalenka will wonder what might have been, because she led 4-2 in the third set and the match was on her racket. And Iga Swiatek won 16 of 20 points 4 games in a row and won it, which... You know, it's all very well saying, well, she's won the one, she's very good, yes, but like Sabalenka only had to hold serve there once realistically to stop the rot, and I think that would have got her over the line. She came into press wearing the biggest mirrored sunglasses you've ever seen and a hat pulled very down low, and, well, you know, she just about kept it together, although she started the press conference in tears, so it's never a good way to do it. George, before we talk about the final, I mean, is Aryna Sabalenka ever going to make a Grand Slam final? Because that's 3 semi-finals now, and to be honest, she looks to have crumbled under the pressure of each one.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny, isn't it? I think she had a really good tournament. I think she's had some pretty testing matches along the way. Collins, who obviously dispatched Osaka, was like 4th round. That's not an easy match. Pliskova. And then, you know, she got off to a flyer, didn't she, against Swiatek, and then just sort of went away. I mean, the third set was decent, pretty close, but I don't know. I mean, it's a really difficult one, isn't it? I still think she probably will win a slam at some point, just by virtue of there'll be one where everyone falls apart and she'll just kind of get through. But there is that little block, isn't there? That said, there's no shame in losing to Swiatek at the minute. And frankly, I thought Swiatek, given the form she was in coming into the tournament, I thought she'd lose to Pegula in the quarterfinals. I really had a feeling that Pegula could be the champion here, and she took care of that. I mean, the second set was really tight, really high quality. But I think she's had 2 really tough matches to get to this final as well. And Jabeur's been, you know, comfortably the second best player in the world the last 4 months. So this is a great final and just the sort of thing we want for women's tennis. You know, top ranked players meeting each other in big matches.
You say Aryna Sabalenka will eventually win one, and there is a mental block. I just want to give you a stat, which is that she's 6-0 in matches this year in Grand Slams where she's lost the first set, and she is 0-3. Or sorry, no, she's not 0-3. I should say each time she has lost in Grand Slams this year, she has won the first set. And that's also true of, I think, her semi-final against Pliskova in Wimbledon last year. She won the first set and then went to pieces a bit. And then she lost to Fernandez in her other semi-final in the US Open, so it was kind of forgivable. I
think I saw that record actually really extends a lot further as well. Like, I think in terms of kind of career Grand Slam, she's got like a really... I mean, she has obviously lost matches where she's not won the first set as well. But when she's not won the first set as well, but she's it's weird, like the flip between the two, like how the percentage of how many matches she's losing when she's a setup compared to when she like loses the first one, which, you know, you kind of, it's really hard to like be like, oh yeah, she's got a rubbish mentality when she does pretty well when she like recovers from a set down. It's almost like she's just not a good front runner. Like people used to talk about Federer being so good as a front runner, like what if he wins the first set, you're never getting back to him. And then there are some players who are, you know, really dogged and determined from behind. And I don't know, that momentum swing after a first set can be really crucial, I suppose. And maybe that's the thing. I don't really know how you work on that, to be honest, James.
Well, yeah, and without wanting to reopen an enormous can of worms, I've been thinking a lot about best of 3 and best of 5 this fortnight, and I've come to the conclusion that men's and women's should be best of 5 from the quarterfinals onwards and best of 3 before then. We will talk more about that at length when we have time, but I'm just saying that I'm going to put that out there as my big plan, and people can think about it and disagree with it, and then we can talk about it maybe during a Christmas episode or something like that. Let's talk about the final then, because we've spoken about we've not really spoken about Caroline Garcia. I have talked about her lots on the podlets. She's played brilliant tennis for the best part of a couple of months, and then she was beaten by Ons Jabeur and didn't play well. I asked her afterwards, did you ever consider stepping back and, you know, giving yourself a bit more time on return because you weren't getting a racket on it? And she said, well, look, this is what's got me this far. I wasn't going to change in the semi-final.
It's funny because earlier, you know, we talked about kind of Tiafoe and Nadal being the swing match for your fantasy. I didn't have Garcia, and my fantasy rivals for the bottles of wine did, and so I really needed her to lose that match, else I was going to be 2 bottles of wine down. But what I would say is, like, the thing I said the whole tournament about why I wouldn't pick Garcia before the tournament was because I think there is a big mental problem there, and when the finish line is in sight, I don't believe she's going to get over the line. She kind of proved me wrong this tournament. I thought that moment would come a lot earlier. I thought, you know, there were a lot of issues in terms of like obstacles to face, including like Andreescu early on, which kind of put me off picking her. So she did kind of exceed my expectations, but then that collapse, the way she'd been playing compared to how she actually turned up in that semi-final was really disappointing. That said, Jabeur is tricky, isn't she? I mean, she is. There's not many players like her on the tour. It's a very different style of game to come up against. So, you know, yeah, it's one of those where you're looking at the draw, and I think the same could be said for Medvedev, for example, on the men's side. I think Medvedev sits in the other half of the draw. If Djokovic was here, he probably beats Kyrgios 4th round, and Medvedev probably reaches the final on the other one. It's just the odd, awkward opponent for people. So Jabeur's maybe like that for Garcia as well.
Yeah, to an extent, and I think it's also worth saying that, to be honest, Garcia wasn't under pressure in this tournament. No one even took her to a tie-break, never mind took a set of her until she got to the semis. She was just absolutely monstering people. I mean, you asked me off air what I thought the best women's match I've watched this week was, and actually, you know what Caroline Garcia did to Coco Gauff was really blooming impressive. Like, she just stood inside the baseline and smoked everything that came at her. And Coco Gauff has hit the fastest serve at this tournament by quite a distance. I think it was the second fastest women's serve in US Open history. And Garcia stood inside the baseline and said, yeah, mate, what have you got? And it worked. So in some ways, I don't think she has proven much about, you know, the ability to get over the line or cope with things mentally. But that's, you know, that you can only beat what's in front of you, and if you're beating them so well, then we can't say you haven't proved anything. So yeah, it kind of stands somewhere in the middle on that one. Calvin Betton has joined us, which is great news, of course, as always. And he hasn't heard all the things we said about him in the first 15 minutes, so that's probably for the best. He doesn't listen back to them, I know for a fact. Well, let's talk about the final in full now. We've just been talking about the women's semi-final and about the beaten finalists, but the beaten semi-finalists, I should say. But the women who are through are Iga Swiatek and Ons Jabeur. It's probably the final we wanted, because it probably is, as George said, the 2 best players in the world at the moment. Calvin, since you're here, a bit of a tactical matchup. How do you think this one plays out for both women? For each of them, is it the exact person they wouldn't want to face, or does it work out all right for them?
I don't think it's the person that Swiatek won't want to face. I don't know if there is one who she won't want to face. I think she probably fancies herself against pretty much anybody. Maybe
Yelena
I still think the one who was. That was just freak though at the start of the year, I think, wasn't it? I don't think she'd. I think Swiatek would be perfectly happy playing Ostapenko in the final of the Slam. Still, I still think the one who she wouldn't want to face at full pelt is Osaka, because she can just take the racket out of anyone's hand. But I don't see she'll have any concerns with Jabeur. I mean, I think it's going to be on Swiatek's racket. I think if she holds herself together mentally, which there's no reason to think that she won't, even though she's been a bit less dominant in recent months. But if she holds herself together, I don't really see any way that Jabeur's going to beat her.
And what about the other way around? If you're on Jabeur, there's lots of different types of players you can beat. Will she just play her own game, or do you think that she'll have to try and exploit certain things? She said before, I think I know what I have to do against her now. I don't know if you know what that is.
I think there's only really one way that Jabeur can play, but I still think it's dependent on Swiatek being well off form on the day. I think if Swiatek plays 7 out of 10, I really don't think Jabeur's got anything to worry her. She can't blow her off court. She's got lovely feel. She's really skillful, is Jabeur, but so is Swiatek. Swiatek's not worried about a player who has good hands and who can sort of slice and dice it and do a few drop shots and that kind of thing. She can do that herself. She's the most complete player. I'd even go as far as to say she's the most complete women's player that we've seen since peak Serena Williams. Is Swiatek. And Serena Williams never got the credit she was due for being a complete player, as I've said on this podcast before. But I think that she can out-hit players. Swiatek can, and she can out-skill them. She's as good an athlete as there is on tour. She's all round. Every match she plays is going to be on her racket, other than, like I say, if she plays Osaka on full form.
George, Iga Swiatek the most complete player since Serena Williams? Reasonable assessment?
Yeah, I think so. I think in terms of complete, in terms of being able to do absolutely everything, I'm not saying she's necessarily been hit the highest level, although she has obviously been absolutely fantastic recently. There's probably a bit of a case for Barty perhaps reaching a higher level, but there's not that much in it between them. I think Swiatek will hit a higher level than Barty. I think she's played, some amazing stuff this year. I also agree with the final, to be honest. I think Swiatek wins this in straight sets pretty comfortably. I would say 3 and 4 would be my kind of prediction. As Calvin says, there's just certain types of players for me that Jabeur will really struggle against. There's people who can hit through her. And Swiatek's also tricky enough to kind of get involved in those engages, but she has got really raw, brilliant power. And the Wimbledon final with Rybakina, Jabeur kind of struggled, I thought, to kind of get into that once Rybakina kind of found her way. And I kind of expect Swiatek just to turn up, knows what she's doing. The pressure's obviously on both of them, but she's been there, done it before. Whereas Jabeur, this is going to be a really, really big iconic moment if she can get over the line. So yeah, I fancy Swiatek quite comfortably.
I think, although I think that the assessment is right that it's probably the 2 best female players in the world at the minute, I also think it's the worst final for women's tennis, because what we really need in women's tennis is a top class women's major final, and I don't think we're going to get it again. I think just a competitive, a good quality competitive women's final, and I don't see us getting that again. I think any of the other matchups would have been a better matchup in the final.
And that is definitely a clip that could come back to haunt you in about 24 hours, Calvin, couldn't it? That one?
Well, most of my quotes do, so I'm confident. You just predicted that she'd lose in straight sets.
I think she'll win in straight sets, but I'm not saying it won't be a good match.
Right.
Yeah. This has been going on for this final sort of curse in the majors has been going on for quite a long time.
Yeah, I think I'm sort of minded to agree with you. I mean, I do look at the semi-final against Garcia, and look at the way Swiatek has played over the last, say, well, I would say 2 weeks, to be honest. And I think that Swiatek is a little bit flawed at the moment. And not, fatally flawed. But I do think that there are chinks in the armour and that she can go away and will have flat bits for 30 or 40 minutes. And it's a question for me of whether Jabeur can capitalise on that.
Yeah, I mean, I said before the tournament I didn't think Swiatek was playing that well, and the record was becoming a bit funny. I still don't think she's played anywhere close to the way she was playing in, say, like April, May this year, compared to now. But what has been impressive is that every time she seems to be in a hole, she is wriggling out of it, and that speaks to me as someone who is peaking at the right times. Actually, she's probably a player we need to start looking less concernedly about kind of results on the tour now, if she's proving she's going to turn up to slams and wriggle out of these moments and kind of, not necessarily peak in terms of form, but peak in terms of that mental toughness to kind of get through matches.
And I think what has become evident in those kind of problem-solving moments is, A, her defence is much better than I think people have really given her credit for before. Like, she runs incredibly well, she runs balls down very well. And also, and this is something that actually I'm kind of ripping off Eurosport's Mats Verlander, who knows what he's talking about every now and again, and sometimes he says it. And he made the point that Swiatek has such an ability to put so many revs on the ball that she can go to like this sort of high net clearance, high safety game. And, when she knows she's not playing well and when she knows she's not, as football managers say, in a good moment... God, I'm doing a lot of accents today. It must be the sleep deprivation. But she can do that, and I think she knows herself well enough to understand when she needs to do that. And I think that's a very valuable skill. So I think... I just think Jabeur is playing well enough to nick a set off her, one way or another. I think she might find a moment where Swiatek goes to pieces a little bit, doesn't quite have the ability to... to problem solve her way out of an issue, or at least can't do it quickly enough. And I think Jabeur is just about good enough to pick up a set. But I'm kind of with Calvin in that I am a bit concerned that it might not be a thriller. And as I said before Calvin got here, I think the last 3 matches of a Grand Slam for women should be 5 sets, and you'd have a lot better chance of it being more of a thriller. I'm not. No, I really want to make so many points on this, but we just haven't got time. It's not the time to do it. I appreciate that. Does anyone else have any other thoughts about the women's final or how the women's draw has unfolded up to now? George,
I think the only thing I'd say is that this is another really good chance for Swiatek to really lay down the marker and start this charge to being one of the absolute greats that I think we all think she can be. This would be slam number 3, first one off clay. If there's any question mark about Swiatek at the minute is, can she start turning multiple slam years in regularly? So I think this is another great opportunity to really build the profile of someone who should be leading the sport for the next 3, 4, 5, 6, maybe 10 years. So these are the sort of matches I want to see her winning well. Obviously, I hope from a neutral perspective we get a good match out of it, but I want to see Swiatek kind of get that dominance going and bring the other players on up with her.
I think as well, it's a good point, George, that she should be leading the sport. I wrote something on Twitter and then for the newspaper this week that caused lots of consternation, where I pointed out that if we got a Ruud versus Rublev US Open men's final, it might be the lowest rated final of all time, which got a lot of people's backs up. And I pointed out that of the semi-finalists, or the quarter-finalists as it was then, there were several who didn't have much of a profile and people weren't that interested in, i.e. Casper Ruud, Andrei Rublev, Karen Khachanov, to an extent Jannik Sinner. I don't think many people know who Jannik Sinner is compared to, normal athletes. And we'll talk a bit more about that in the second half probably. But what I wanted to say is that Iga Swiatek is both an interesting person, she's an interesting player, she's a bloody dominant player as well. As you say, George, not as dominant now as maybe she was 4 months ago, but she's got it all. Like, she's thoughtful, she's interesting, she's quite funny, she's a bit weird, and she's also a brilliant tennis player. And so I don't know where the disconnect is that she isn't a household name. And as you say, I think she just has to keep winning Grand Slams. She's won 2 French Opens, and if you're not Rafa Nadal, the French Open always has a bit less of an impact. And I wonder if that's it. But if she'd won Wimbledon, everyone in Britain would know who she was, but she didn't, so they don't. But maybe this could go a long way to kind of pushing her over the edge. George or Calvin, why isn't Iga Swiatek a worldwide celebrity?
I personally think it's just because of where she's from. You don't get mad. I mean, who was the last Polish superstar?
No, Robert Lewandowski, I guess, but
is he though? You know, it's like if you were to list the best, he famously has. I don't know if he's won the Ballon d'Or, but he certainly should have won it more than he has. I don't know whether he won it last year. Did he?
I think they cancelled it the year he was like nailed on to win. So
yeah,
I'm not sure if he has won it.
You know, if Lewandowski was English or French, I reckon he'd have 4 or 5 of them now. I mean, he's been maybe I'm exaggerating there, 4 or 5, but he's been the best striker in the world for a good 5 years, I'd say. But the same thing, I think it's just, I do think it's and it's nothing against the Polish. I think unless you're from Britain, America, Australia, France, Spain, or Russia, and to a degree China, but that's strictly limited to China or Asia, you don't get many superstars, I don't think.
George?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like we're in danger of feeding a very ugly part of Twitter that is saying there's a Western narrative against kind of people from these regions. But there is a degree of truth with that. There is a degree of, as stupid as this probably sounds, like the spellings of the names that are harder to pronounce in the Western world when you think of the big powerhouses of media and how they kind of promote people. A name with an S, Wiatek, isn't as obvious to read as like I don't know, like Messi or Ronaldo. It kind of follows more kind of Western dialogue, I suppose. But that said, I don't think there's any reason she can't become the mega superstar we think she can be. The way she does it is she is just the mega superstar on court and wins and wins and wins and wins. And to be fair, she actually hasn't done that yet at the Grand Slams. That's the big challenge for her now that will kind of propel her into the stratosphere. I still think she can be. And, Lewandowski's probably a good example in terms of he definitely, for me, is a pretty big superstar now. But he hasn't always been. And as Calvin said, it's taken longer and longer to get that recognition. So the ball's in her court, if you like, I think, to really kind of smash through that media wall.
Yes, to break down the conspiracy against Polish people. But no, I mean, I'm joking, but I think there are valid points there. And yeah, I think there is an element to which her name's a bit hard to pronounce and people don't really care to bother to learn how to pronounce people's names. And yes, she's from a part of the world that doesn't get much recognition probably. So I think valid points there. Coming up next, we're going to talk about the men's final. We'll look back at at least one amazing semi-final, a week of Carlos Alcaraz late nights, and that famous Twitter thread.
Football fans, grab your favorite food and a cooler full of drinks. It's time to tailgate. Whether you're serving up hot dogs and hamburgers or breaking out the barbecue, feel free to kick things up a notch with Frank's Red Hot. And when you're looking to cool it down, reach for a nice cold Bud Light. The team's going all the way this year. Make sure you're there to cheer them on. And don't forget to fire it up with Frank's Red Hot and cool it down with Bud Light. Enjoy responsibly. Anheuser-Busch Bud Light Beer, St. Louis, Missouri.
So we've talked about the women's final. We've predicted it's going to be rubbish, which is a shame.
I've not predicted that.
Presumably we've offended about half of our listeners, for which we apologise. But it's time to talk about the men's final. We've got Casper Ruud up against Carlos Alcaraz. The French Open finalist, Casper Ruud, up against the man we think will win many Grand Slams. I think 53 is George's last count, and this is his first opportunity to win one. Carlos Alcaraz, who was also responsible for 3 of the latest tennis nights of my life, he has been on court this week for 13 hours and 19 minutes. His earliest finish was last night, which was 10 past 12. He has previously finished at 2:30, 2:50. It's all getting a bit silly, quite frankly, for a 19-year-old. He needs to get in bed earlier on I wrote something the other day that he's like most teenagers. He's likely to be up at all hours, but in fact, he would probably much rather be asleep. George, you're throwing your hand up with your mic on mute, which is always a bold thing to do. Why don't you tell us what you've got to say?
I was actually going to ask James, because I know you're on site and might have seen some kind of media statistics, but has a player ever won a Grand Slam winning 4 5-setters in a row? If the final were
three 5-setters in a row.
But I'm just saying, if the final went to 5 sets as well, has anyone ever done 4 in a row?
So the last 2 people have won Grand Slams after back-to-back 5-setters. I don't know about back-to-back-to-back-to-back, but I do know that 2 people have won Grand Slams after going to back-to-back 5-setters. Do you have
Djokovic
a guess?
Djokovic has won against Murray and Nadal 2012 Australia.
So, sorry, after back-to-back. So it's got to be back-to-back, like quarter-final, semi-final?
Right, I see. Oh,
basically,
okay.
I'm almost certain you're not going to get this, because it's Stefan Edberg at the 1992 US Open final, and then it's Gustavo Kuerten, I'm pretty sure, the 1997 French Open. So, yeah. Look, put it this way. People don't do it very often. Men to win back-to-back 5-setters en route to a Grand Slam singles title. So that actually, I think, could mean any round. Federer at the Australian Open in 2017, 3 of the last 4 went to 5 sets. I'm also told that Edberg's, in that 1992 run, Edberg played the longest match ever at the US Open, and Carlos Alcaraz's match against Marin Cilic was the 2nd longest match ever. Although how much of that was Marin Cilic bouncing the ball hasn't been recorded, but I can only assume quite a lot of it, quite frankly. I've already spoken about Alcaraz Sinner, and it will have taken place at the early hours of the morning in the UK, as did, frankly, Alcaraz Tiafoe, which was electric on so many levels. I mean, I remember Murray Otter, which I appreciate wasn't like, a particularly seismic match, but Andy Murray against Oscar Otter under the roof on centre court at Wimbledon was insanely loud. Like, I don't remember being in a tennis stadium that loud, and I think last night tops it. Because it was amazing, really, because what you had was, for people who don't know Arthur Ashe Stadium, you've got a lower bowl, which is like, the first tier of expensive seats. Then you've got a ring of corporate boxes, which are really expensive. And then you've got the upper tier, which is blooming high. And anyone who's been on my Instagram this week will know it's very, very high, which is cheaper seats. And typically, on a normal week, they can go for about $40. So, about 40 quid now, because the pound doesn't mean anything. So, they're vaguely affordable. And what you had was down the bottom, every time Tiafoe won a point, all the Americans, who were clearly people with money, in the lower bowl would go mental. And then when Alcaraz won a point, all the Spanish and the Spanish-speaking fans, who were clearly up the top, would go crazy. And it was this bizarre dynamic where it was almost like a football crowd, because there genuinely were 2 segregated groups of fans. And the noise when Carlos Alcaraz ran down 3 drop shots and then ran back to the baseline and flipped a forehand passing shot past Tiafoe, the noise that everyone made, which can only be described as like an "oh shit," it will just live with me forever. And Francis Tiafoe gave as good as he got. He won 2 tie breaks. He saved a match point in the 4th set. He saved a match point and he went over to his corner. A corner, and he just said, "I'm putting my heart on the fucking line. I'm putting my heart on the line. Let's go." And I think, Francis Tiafoe we used to just think of as just an entertainer. But he's an entertainer, but he's also bloody talented, and I think we'll be back at this level again.
Yeah, this was a really significant for Tiafoe on a lot of levels. I think you mentioned the tiebreaks there, James. I'm pretty sure I saw a stat about him winning 8 tiebreaks this tournament without losing one. and that's some sort of Grand Slam record in the men's game. But that really speaks volumes of kind of how well he's playing in big moments in matches, because tiebreaks are always very tense, often seen as a coin toss. It can go either way. So that was really impressive in itself. But yeah, this was really the first time where I've kind of thought about TFO being a future Slam champion. I didn't really believe, to be honest, beforehand, but the level he's kind of brought, the win over Nadal, okay, where Nadal's at, not quite sure at the minute. You mentioned in your pod earlier in the week, James, about there's been a lot going on in his personal life, and we're still not sure if he was kind of 100% fit or not as well. So, but either way, to beat Nadal is really impressive at a Grand Slam, because that guy just doesn't go away, and you have to beat him. And TFO brought that, and he brought it to Alcaraz as well. And he took it to Rublev, who, okay, he's not necessarily having the best season, but he's played really well at this tournament, and he's completely dismantled Norrie, who's not easily dismantlable either. So yeah, I've been really, really impressed by him. It was his post-match speech was actually quite, the on-court one, I mean, was quite sad, really, when he said he felt like he'd let everyone down. I don't think that at all. But he did also say, I promise you I'm going to come back and win this. It's going to be tough. Alcaraz is 5-6 years younger than he is, so he's only going to get better and better. So that's where the bar's going to go. But TFO's really upped the stakes this week, and it's only a good thing for Francis TFO to be playing well. A big American male star would be massive for tennis right now.
Yeah, and I think what's exciting about him, and Calvin will probably be able to speak to this on a more interesting level, is that he seems to have a lot of room for improvement. He served at 46% first serve last night. That doesn't win you a lot of matches, and he got blooming close to beating Carlos Alcaraz. His backhand is bizarre. I mean, it's this kind of janky shovel of a shot, and it doesn't really have anything on it, and you'd feel there's a lot he could do with that to get better. So, I mean, Calvin, when you look at players, I know you're always looking at where they can go and what you can do with them. TFO must be a guy you look at and go, crikey, there's some raw material here.
Yeah, without doubt, he should be a top 10 in the world player. He's got everything that's required to be a top 10 in the world player. I don't think it's even a technical thing with him or anything to do with his shots. He just doesn't seem to be able... It's a consistency thing for him. It's getting result after result, week after week. And every time he looks like taking off. And I don't want to criticise him this week because he's had a really good tournament, but you feel that he has to start winning those matches time and again. That's what Alcaraz is doing. He's winning the 5-setters, and it's like last year at Wimbledon, he beat Tsitsipas, and then did he lose the next round?
What a great question.
I don't know whether it was. It might have won another round or something. It might have gone, but he didn't go deep into the tournament. And this one, that's always been TFO's problem. He can play one great match and then sometimes two, but not three. And that's what you've got to do. You've got to. He's capable of beating anybody in the world, as we've seen. But he just doesn't do it. And I really hope he does, because there you do have, when we're talking about potential superstars, you have one who I think could be the biggest superstar in tennis. I really do think that he's everything that people think that Nick Kyrgios is, and they're wrong about Nick Kyrgios.
I mean, what people also probably don't know is Francis Tiafoe has an amazing story. His parents were immigrants to America from Sierra Leone. His dad got a job building a tennis centre. When they finished building it, he got the job as head of maintenance, and his kids basically just sort of picked up tennis rackets from there, and managed to get a few lessons, and it snowballed from there. He's a little bit self-taught. It's why when you look at his backhand, it looks a bit weird. And I watched his serve a lot last night, and it's so easy. Like, there's not a lot going on. There's not a lot of back bend. It's just kind of easy power, and it is an absolute weapon as well, by the way. And I think that story creates so much for people to kind of latch onto. I literally texted my missus last night and was like, this guy, he lost, but this is him. And she was like, oh, that's amazing. What a guy, Calvin.
He does have a great story, phenomenal story, and he's also a great guy. He's an absolute dude on the court, in press conferences, when he's interviewed, on the court. He's just so open and natural, and there's no airs and graces about him. And he's so charismatic, so funny. He'd just be great if we had him at the back end of every tournament. I think you can increase tennis's sort of popularity by 10% just by having Frances Tiafoe at the back end of every tournament. And on that, I don't know whether any of the listeners are interested, but I do have some footage of Tiafoe when he was 14 at Tarbes. Maybe we could put it on the Love Tennis Twitter feed. Might be interesting just to see players. That would have been, how old is he now? He's in 98, isn't he? So he'd be 24, yeah. That'd be 10 years ago. Yeah.
Just to kind of back up Calvin's point about this guy not going deep at big tournaments. One previous quarterfinal, Australia got battered by Nadal. Not been to the quarters of a slam since. I think the more telling one for me actually is that he's only reached one quarterfinal at a Masters, which is kind of crazy considering how good he is. You know, this year he's had third round Indian Wells, fourth round Miami, first round Madrid, first round Rome, second round Rogers Cup, second round Cincinnati. Like, that's not good enough for a guy this good. So he's really got to bring that consistency to his game.
And it's not, George, it's not that he's not, we're not looking like a Berrettini, say, here where you go, he just can't beat the top players. That's not his problem. It's losing to just guys who he shouldn't be losing to week after week at the majors and at the Masters. That's his problem.
I mean, in fairness, the four guys he's lost to over the summer have been like Kyrgios, Alcaraz, I think Korda, and Fritz. So they're not all in isolation. They're not terrible losses, I suppose. Like, all of them have kind of shown good form at different points this year. But, you know, it's the wins over Korda and Fritz you've got to start delivering regularly to kind of move ahead of that level.
Yeah.
Losses to Alcaraz and Kyrgios, you want to make them 50-50, really.
Yeah. It's also worth noting that he's only been seeded at Grand Slams for the last 3, I think. So Roland Garros this year was his first seeding at a Grand Slam. So that makes life a bit harder, you know, as we know from Andy Murray talking about how much he wants to be seeded at Grand Slams, for example. And albeit it's a different situation, it's the same idea. You want to find your place in a draw much easier than if you're not seeded. So, you know, that will make a difference, I'm sure. He was world number 26 coming into this tournament. He's going to go up to world number 19, so inside the top 20 for the first time in his career. And I think probably you would expect with a few hardcourt tournaments coming up that he continues that rise. I can't imagine he's defending loads of points off the top of my head, but I can't actually remember what he was up to this time last year. Might have been playing on the clay in South America or something, because I know he did a lot of that. Let's move on. I'm not going to talk about Karen Khachanov a huge amount because I don't know how much there is to say about Karen Khachanov. Like, he's got an enormous serve. It's very good. It's not fascinating to watch. And Casper Ruud nullified it. I guess the one thing to say, and maybe, George, this is a good way to segue into the final, is Casper Ruud served extremely well against Karen Khachanov. I think only 16% of his first serves were returned, as I recall. Oh, no, sorry. I've confused this stat. Let me go again. Some 33% and I can't remember this blooming stat. It was really good and it's gone out my head. George, tell me about how Casper Ruud's an underrated server.
Yeah, I think he is a good server. He's got a very big forehand as well. So he's actually a decent 1-2 puncher, as well as kind of having this kind of grindy style. I think there was actually some really, really good stats while I was watching this match on Amazon, and Mark Petchey was talking about this. They were comparing like rotations on the ball. So obviously, like, everyone knows Nadal has been famed for the amount of rotations he puts through his forehand or whatever. I can't really remember the figures he's reached, but very, very high. But Ruud's were also very, very high. So on the forehand, it was like average 3,200 rotations, which is a lot. Like, I promise you that is high. And Khachanov's was around 2,700, 2,800. What was really interesting was how many rotations were on the two-handed backhand. Like, they were numbers you'd expect for a one-hander. Yeah. So it was around like 2,700, 2,800 for a two-hander. Like, I think that's a quite underrated part that you maybe not see unless you're watching this guy live. Like, the amount of spin he's putting through that backhand, big topspin, heavy, pushing people back. That's really impressive figures. I think Khachanov's were something like 1,200, like by comparison on his backhand. So, Khachanov's got quite a flat backhand, and I suppose you'd say like the Ruud one's maybe a little bit safer. But I found that really interesting. And I think this is again a problem tennis has when you watch it on telly, that you wouldn't necessarily see that watching that well, and you'd only start to see it if you kind of hear a comment and then go and watch it live and see how much that backhand's kind of kicking up. But yeah, I thought that was a good analysis by Amazon.
Yeah, it is actually very interesting, and it's something that I never appreciated about Rafa Nadal really until I watched him live, and actually until I saw him practice live, where you can get as close as you can to the ball bouncing, quite frankly, and that really gave me a sense of exactly how insane, the amount of spin this guy puts on the ball and how difficult that makes him to play against really is. I don't know if I always appreciated that. Calvin, do you think Casper Ruud is just overall a bit underrated? I mean, look, if he's one match away from being world number one and US Open champion, because whoever wins this match will be world number one on Monday. Do you think if that happens, people will probably take the piss out of him a bit?
I mean, I saw a fact the other day that if Frances Tiafoe won the US Open, Casper Ruud would be world number one without ever winning a title above a 250. Which, listen, right, Casper Ruud's not the best tennis player in the world, whether he wins or loses tomorrow. So I've been a big defender of the rankings in recent weeks, in the face of Nick Kyrgios's ramblings that he just thinks he should be world number one based on nothing. Because he thinks he's good.
Yeah.
That would be an anomaly if Casper Ruud was world number one, I think. And that's no criticism of him, but would anybody really think that he's the best tennis player in the world? Because I wouldn't. And I don't think he's going to win. I think unless Alcaraz has a meltdown, he's going to beat him. I'm certain of that.
I think we're in a really interesting phase of the men's rankings now, because Ruud could potentially be world number one for like 3 weeks. The gap's going to be that small. Whoever wins this thing, like there will be great opportunities for kind of Nadal and Alcaraz to pass him. Well, Nadal probably won't play that much in the back end of the season, but Alcaraz might kind of run and charge through, etc. But I think I read the other day on Twitter that Djokovic, the record for like the most ranking points for world number one is around 16,000, and that's about 10,000 more than these three guys have right now in terms of the live ranking. So one of them will kind of pass the 6,000 mark, but that kind of gives you a sense of like not how easy it is to be world number one, but how less of an obstacle it is given, Ruud's been to 2 Grand Slam finals this year. That's a big old chunk of points. Not having Djokovic at 2 majors has probably allowed people in, to be honest, because let's be honest, he's the best player in the world for me still. And he's down to world number 7 now, which shows you what weight missing these tournaments has.
Yeah, it's really difficult, isn't it? Because Medvedev, I mean, no one got ranking points at Wimbledon, so that takes some of the validity
that is
of
a big
the
factor, to be fair.
And that does change things. I think if Berrettini had got ranking points at Wimbledon, Berrettini's going to absolutely plummet in the rankings because he's obviously defended 2,000 unsuccessfully. But then if you look at almost anyone really in the top 20, about half of them did well at Wimbledon, about half of them didn't. So if you take that into consideration, you just completely reshuffle the rankings. I don't know. It is difficult. You want the rankings to be right. I think people will say, I spoke to Muratoglu the other day and he said the rankings are the rankings, and I was like, well, that's a bit of a truism that I'm not sure it necessarily applies.
Wonderful insight. Cheers for that.
But, it's sort of, I kind of see where he's coming from. Like Casper Ruud will sit in a press conference if he's world number one and say, I'm world number one. Suck that.
And just going back to the match itself, I mean, Ruud, I thought played pretty well actually in the French Open final. I don't think he was that overawed. It's just that Nadal's better than him. So I think, to be fair to Casper Ruud, he's grown up a lot the last kind of 2 years. He is a talented player. As Calvin says, he's not the best player in the world, but actually he is making big matches. He's performing well in slams. And he's really improved his game on a hard court. You know, we've taken the mick out of him in the past for kind of turning up into those 3 clay events at the back of Wimbledon and winning 3 titles or whatever. You know, he's turning up to big events, and he's beating good players at this tournament again. You know, okay, not the strongest in the history of slams in terms of runs, but I think we do need to kind of say he's done well. And it wouldn't surprise me that much if he did actually beat Alcaraz in a weird way. I think Alcaraz is a comfortably better player, but I make this final much closer on paper than I do the women's one.
I think Casper Ruud's very good at nullifying big serves. You know, he's beaten Hatchinoff and Berrettini in the last 2 rounds, and pretty comfortably. Like, Hatchinoff nicked the 3rd set in the semi-final, you know, breaking at 5-6, which, funnily enough, he did to Kyrgios twice. But realistically, Ruud was much better than him almost throughout. And I think Ruud's, as I say, I think he's excellent against the big server and nullifying them. But Alcaraz has no serve to speak of. Like, he does not rely on serve really on any level. And actually, it was probably the weakest element of his game against Tiafoe. Albeit he served pretty well against Sinner. So you say, well, okay, you got to out-rally him. And I just think that Ruud's baseline game is just constantly looking for that inside-in forehand. And I think if you're going to spend your life hitting inside-in forehands against the fastest guy on tour and the best guy hitting off balance, you know, if he's running into that forehand corner, I think you're going to get yourself in trouble quite a lot.
And just to dampen all of the listeners' enthusiasm, Alcaraz has won every set they've played so far in their 2 meetings.
Have they been close? Did lots of the games go to juice, perhaps?
Well, I would say the score in Miami was fairly close. 7-5, 6-4 in the final there that Alcaraz won. So
I bet loads of those games went to juice. So
loads of them. All of them went to juice.
Calvin, when you look at these 2 games, I mean, I know you've already said you think Alcaraz will beat him, but like if Ruud is to beat him, what does he do? Is it you know, nailing him to the backhand corner? Is it trying to do things a bit differently?
I really don't know. I'm glad I'm not Ruud's coach going into that. So I'd have to come up with a game plan that I wouldn't have any belief in. It's one of those that they play similar, and Alcaraz. They play very similar games, and Alcaraz hits the ball about 7 or 8% harder. Maybe not that, even if it's 2% harder or 3% harder. And if you play backhand to backhand or forehand to forehand, and one player hits the ball on average at 60 miles an hour, and the other player hits the ball at 62 miles an hour, there's only going to be one winner there, because the slower player's backhand will break down before the other guy's backhand because the ball's coming through a little bit faster. And I really don't understand what the route to victory is for Casper Ruud. I'll watch it because I'll be interested to see what he does, but I think it's all going to depend on how Alcaraz turns up. If Alcaraz turns up, and again, if Alcaraz can play, even if Alcaraz plays 6 out of 10, Ruud's going to have to play 9 out of 10 to win. If Alcaraz plays 7 out of 10, I don't think there's any way Ruud can win.
I think the thing I've been impressed with by Ruud that maybe I haven't been so impressed with in the past is like that 1-2 punch on serve and forehand. I do think people are underestimating how much he's improved kind of in that arena, particularly on a hard court. So, you know, when Cam was talking about Ruud playing 9 out of 10, I think the serve is going to be really bloody important for him. He needs to get on top in those rallies quickly. He needs to be putting the ball away quite quickly, which I think he's capable of doing. And actually at the French Open against Nadal, there were points he was actually very much on top of him. The issue then became killing Nadal, like actually seeing him off in these rallies. Like there were so many chances he had to actually win points well from the way of setting up. And you're like, how on earth is Nadal getting to these balls? The issue for him is Alcaraz will probably get to even more freakish balls than Nadal can on clay because he is ludicrously quick, ludicrously flexible, and just seems to never tire, which is a pretty lethal combination before you even get onto the fact he hits the ball bloody well as well. So, yeah, it's going to be a big challenge. I do kind of fancy Ruud to get a set. I've watched bits and pieces of Alcaraz. I don't think he's playing as well as he was earlier in the year. I think there are a few more chinks in the armor. I think there are chinks in the armor mentally as well, which sounds really odd. He's just won 3 bets of 5 sets, but I think there are chinks of armor compared to kind of that early first quarter of the year.
No, I think that's absolutely spot on, actually. And, I have to say, off-court coaching has helped Carlos Alcaraz a hell of a lot in this tournament. Like, there's been a number of times when he's walked to the end Juan Carlos Ferrero is at, and he just looks lost. And there was one point where he was walking over to him, and because I was following Jose Morgado on Twitter, who understands Spanish because he's Portuguese, and I understand there's some cognate language there, and he said that Alcaraz was saying, "Tell me what to serve. I don't know what to serve." And I think Ferrero is not shy of just telling him what to serve, because even before the off-court coaching was allowed, Ferrero was coaching. So I think it's interesting that's definitely a thing.
And it should be said, Sinner let him off the hook badly twice in that final. He should have won that 4th set. It was a break-up in the 5th, and he played a couple of stinking games straight after that. But it wasn't Alcaraz really turning that around as much as Sinner getting tight, I thought, from where I was sitting, which I know, James, you were there. You might have a different perspective on that in the stands, but it felt Sinner had that match on his rackets. He was playing as well as Alcaraz. It was a brilliant match, but then he just got a little bit tight in those big moments, and it cost him.
Yeah, but I think Alcaraz can make you tight as well. I think because you have to go for the lines a bit more. I mean, speaking of going for the lines, Carlos Alcaraz painted that court last night. Like, it was already painted, and Alcaraz made sure. Because, there were, even in the first set alone, there were probably 4 different occasions when Alcaraz hit a shot, it went past Tiafoe, and he just stood there with his hands on his hips and went, "I don't understand how you've clipped the line again." And then he'd asked for the review on the screen, and it would have clipped, the smallest part of the line you could possibly find. It was completely ridiculous. Like, I've never seen anything like it. And I think that makes you tight. And I think the fact that he runs everything down means that you think, oh, here's an easy put-away forehand. No, hang on, it's not an easy put-away forehand. It's Carlos Alcaraz. I'm going to have to stick it in the corner. Oh, look, I've missed it.
And look, we've spoken a bit about kind of how significant this win would be for Swiatek in building her profile. You cannot underestimate the stratospheres Alcaraz can start going to if this guy just starts picking up slam after slam. This is a massive match again for tennis in terms of this platform to build a major star. If anything, it's a slight shame it's not Alcaraz against one of the big 3 or big 4. That's the sort of match you want in this situation. That's perhaps what's lacking. But if we get Alcaraz winning this, coming into Australia, whatever he'd be ranked, potential final with like Novak there, that's what tennis needs right now, is this amazing player playing the best players in the world, winning big titles, and then beating guys like Djokovic in slams.
There's a kind of dream scenario where it's Alcaraz Djokovic in the Australian Open final next January, and it actually doesn't matter who wins at that point, because Alcaraz,
if Djokovic is allowed in the country.
Well, yeah, because he's technically banned. Calvin, I just wanted to ask you, because I mentioned it there and it made me think that I hadn't spoken to you about it, about the off-court coaching. And I know we've spoken a bit about it more generally, but I've had the chance to see it up close now and hear it, because they've mic'd the coaches' boxes quite well. And it's been interesting how some coaches say almost nothing, some use a lot of hand signals, some say lots. I was watching the doubles finals yesterday, which we haven't mentioned, by the way. Joe Salisbury and Rajiv Ram retaining their doubles title. First men's doubles US Open retention for 25 years since the Woodies. But they beat Wes Koolhof and Neil Skupski. And at one point, Rob Morgan was standing up saying to Wes and Neil, keep talking to each other. Don't keep doing it. You've got to do it. Keep talking to each other. And I thought that was interesting contrast to other coaches who've been giving lots of tactical advice from the sidelines. And I wonder whether you thought, if you were in a situation where you were allowed to off-court coach, what you would err on. Obviously, it varies from player to player, but what would your preference be? Do you want to be saying, go tee on this serve more, or do you want to be saying just, settle yourself down, work this out, blah, blah,
blah? I think it depends on the context of the match. If the player isn't, I mean, I've no problem admitting I do plenty of off-court coaching anyway, I always have. And there was a situation a few years ago where a couple of lads who I was coaching in doubles, one of the players kept taking the sudden death juices, and it was against a left-hander, and he had a particular technical problem that was causing a problem there, and he kept taking it, and I physically stood up and shouted because it was getting towards the end of the match, and they'd done it again, and I physically stood up and shouted, told them for the other player to take the sudden death juice, and I got a warning for it. But they ended up winning the match. They won that sudden death juice and got one. so I didn't mind. But what I will say is, I always think if you want to know who the best coaches are, look at the guys who are more concise and are giving direct, specific information and not just rambling white noise all the time. Because when you're on the match court, the player on the match court, they won't take in a whole lot of information.
Yeah.
If you say to them something, serve T, then, or more depth or something, 3 or 4 word. I once heard a comment that any sort of coaching statement you should be able to put it on the front of a T-shirt or on a Post-it note. And that's what you want. So if you see anyone who's just shouting endlessly, talking endlessly, I always tend to think they're a bit of a blagger and they don't know specifically what they should be saying. And it's not helping the player.
I've got real visions of Calvin coaching a top 10 player in the future at a Grand Slam, and to get around the coaching laws, he's just got a load of different T-shirts he keeps changing the slogan on.
I've got, I can't tell it on air, but I've got a phenomenal, not from me, but from a player's parent, a phenomenal hand signal story for off-court coaching.
But, this is great. This is something that if you subscribe to Love Tennis Podcast Extra, which doesn't exist, but make me an offer in my DMs and we'll see what we can arrange.
I'll tell you two about it when we finish the podcast, because this is brilliant. It might be the funniest thing I've ever experienced in coaching.
That's incredible. I mean, honestly, that might be the way to launch our subscription service, which isn't a plan yet, or really ever. But anyway, it's been interesting, nevertheless, to see the off-court coaching. I think it has added something. I've often, if I'm on court, I've often got a live stream and stick headphones on, and it definitely seems to add something.
Well, what I will say, James, and I was trying to get there, is I think during the intensity of a match, there are certain things that players won't see. And that coaches will. And I think that's where it could make a difference, where you can look at it and go, that they've not noticed this is a thing. And I think that's where high level coaching really is. And as I often say, because my dad always comes with this one all the time, why does Federer have a coach? No one can tell him how to play tennis. That's not really what it's about. It's another pair of eyes to help out. And I think that's where we could see a big difference in using it. I think it's great, and I think it's great that they're miking up the coaches' boxes. I think it adds something. It'll add an extra dimension to the watching value of tennis as well, as a spectator sport.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think I learned a huge amount from what Will Mayer, Nick Kyrgios's physiotherapist, is saying to him every point. But even that, I will admit, was vaguely interesting. Just the kind of things they were trying to get Nick to do, because
they tell him to do some stretches or something.
Well, no, because his physio is basically his mate.
Yeah, I found that bizarre that Nick Kyrgios, again, I'm going to criticise him again here, right? And he's played brilliantly this week. You got to give him credit for it the last 2 weeks, all summer really. But he makes a decision that he brags about all the time, that he doesn't have a coach in his box, but then criticises the people who are in his box for not knowing as much about tennis as he does. You can't have it both ways.
I think I might apply the Dan Evans rule to this, which is, I once asked Dan Evans why he said something he said on court, and he said, "You can't pay attention to what I say when I'm on court. It doesn't mean anything," which I think is probably pretty accurate. Kyrgios oversteps the line on a regular basis on the court, but his sort of meaningless chunterings probably pretty irrelevant. George, I'm going to ask you for your full prediction for the men's final. I need a set count and a winner.
Yeah, I think Alcaraz in 4, Ruud to win the third set in a late rally.
That is specific. Calvin, you don't have to be as specific as that. I just need a winner and a set count.
I think Alcaraz will win in straights.
I think I'm going to have to agree with George, and I hate that. I really want to say Alcaraz in 5, just because I think 4-5 sets in a row would be amazing.
That would be fun.
But I think probably 4. I'll throw it open to any other business if anyone has any, but I don't think we're going to have any. George, you've always got something. How's your knee?
Well, knees going quite well. I've increased my capabilities of what I can lift now. I'm quite pleased. And actually, I can tell you my fun headline news, James, is I've lost 5 kilograms in the last month. So I was quite pleased with myself
super
this
news,
morning.
mate. Well done. I mean, I'm not gonna pass comment on that as a man who could do with losing about 10 kilograms. So well done. That's all I can say. Thank you very much for listening. As always, I really hope you enjoy the finals. They're 9:00 BST kickoff, so that's 9 p.m. Saturday night and Sunday night. I'll be out here in New York. Do follow me on Twitter. I'll try and do a podlet before I leave New York on Monday after the final. The morning after the night before, as it will be. But otherwise, thank you very much for listening, and please do come back next time.
Sports Social Podcast Network.